I'm joined by Sarah Plumbridge, one of the directors from GSE, and we're going to collaborate on a podcast to talk about a very important subject, which is mental health, specifically in the construction industry.
So we also have our own podcast. It's called Safe and Sound Structures, and which is slightly different to your podcast. The Safe and Sound is purely addressing wellbeing issues within the construction industry. Everyone is talking about it. Nothing is actually happening. And I think that we're both sort of quite frustrated, I suppose.
I think it's something that we've talked about off the camera and we talked about away from the podcast, and it became quite apparent quite quickly that we've both got a passion for the industry that we work in, and we understand the importance of the people within it. And I suppose that the mission here is to join forces, to come from our slightly different perspectives, and really give the same message, which is mental health is a serious issue. Listen to what we've got to say. If it helps you in any way, act on it, and then push into those influencers in the industry, leaders, etc., to take action.
No, absolutely. I'm going to use this point to say that neither Ben or myself are medical professionals. But if you identify with any of the issues which we're talking about today, please do not hesitate to contact your GP or Mind or the Samaritans or your workplace mental health first aider if you have one available to you. So our guest... It's the delightful Marc Preston.
What a gentleman.
Marc is the founder of New Foundation Counselling, and is also the managing director of Vertis Development Management, and they are a PMQS company. So he's got the psychotherapy qualifications, but also a really robust in-depth knowledge of the industry in itself. Marc has been a champion on trying to change the legislations within legislations within the industry. And I think that some of the insights which Marc is going to be able to sort of give us going to be invaluable.
I'm really excited. I've had a limited time. I met Marc just today, but even the short conversation we've had off camera on the way down to the podcast studio was incredibly educational, and I think there's a lot to come from this.
Fantastic. Can't wait. Let's get stuck in.
Marc, we're talking about mental health in this podcast, and specifically in the environment which I work, which is the construction industry. Mental health is an incredibly important subject, but probably more important is the ability to understand how and when people are affected and what that looks like so that early intervention can be achieved. What I'd like to just focus on for the next few minutes is the difference between burnout and the difference between stress, and the relevance of what I'd like to concentrate on for the next few minutes is what kind of mental health issues are most common, and two in particular would be burnout and stress. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting for me to know what the differences are, and then moving on from that, how we can identify those by way of symptom and what we should do next.
Okay, that's a really good question. I've been doing a lot of work in the industry promoting better mental health and trying to unlock the action plan for improvement. And we talk a lot about stress and anxiety. And there's ongoing research as to what the causation is for stress and anxiety, and a big focus on it. But it's quite interesting. This has made me think that we don't focus enough on the holistic type of symptoms that we see, and burnout. Something that's also prevalent and very important. But whether we're talking about stress, anxiety or burnout, what we're looking for is change in behaviours.
Sure, okay.
And I think that as soon as someone is aware of changing behaviours, then if you've got a mental health first aider at work, that's the time to get them involved and have a chat with them. I mean, there are a lot of common features between stress, anxiety, and burnout. But stress usually sort of categorised as sort of sometimes being overwhelmed, you sort of hyperactivity, and that sort of thing. Where burnout is at the opposite end of the spectrum, so the causation is possibly similar. Okay. But with burnout, people can't be bothered anymore. They're disenfranchising themselves from the workplace. They're sort of going solo. So whereas you might have had someone who's really engaged in the process, leading from the front, if they're suffering from burnout, they just can't be bothered anymore.
Yeah.
And there's decreased output and productivity. We talk about presenteeism in stress and anxiety. That's where people come to work, but they don't necessarily do any work. And you could sort of describe the reduced output as a sort of form of presenteeism. But there are some subtle differences. But I think the most important thing to really be aware of is change of behaviours. We've talked about, quite a lot recently, how we respond to a mental health crisis in the workplace. And we're promoting the sort of good to talk scenario. And it is good to talk to someone, it could be a lifesaver.
I know Sarah is going to pick up on the intervention side of things a little bit later on, so I'll leave that to her in terms of how she approaches that. I've got a list in front of me of symptoms, and it's broken down into 3 categories. I think it'd be good to sort of focus on that. We've got physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and then behavioural. You've talked about a few things there, and in terms of outputs, in terms of changes in behaviour. Physical symptoms are probably, some are easy to spot, I would argue, some less easy. In terms of, I'm going to read the first one on this list just as a case in point. Feeling tired or exhausted most of the time. Now, that is an individual sensation. That is something that you feel as the person that is suffering from the symptom. And it can be disguised, can't it? So in terms of how we look for these things, I'm assuming that we would need to look at this holistically, as you said earlier, and in a general sense. But at what point does someone do, and this might be a tricky question, sorry, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but at what point do we say if someone's just tired, having a bad day, had an argument, trips over the dog, or actually this is concerning now, we need to perhaps have a chat with this person? People are often concerned about interfering with other people's lifestyles, and I think that's probably a barrier that needs to be broken down generally. But any thoughts around that in terms of how, when, and what?
Well, anyone can be tired on a particular day. So they could have had a heavy night before. Could have been a thunderstorm, so they didn't get a lot of sleep. There could be an ill child in the house, so there's less sleep. But over a period of time, if someone is constantly yawning, that they're sort of articulating, they've come into work, but they feel sort of knackered, tired. They're sort of creeping off for break times, having a quick 20 winks. They're sort of leaving early, and their general demeanour is someone, is someone that's sort of tired and exhausted, and sort of droopy shoulders. And you can tell that if you know a person, fairly well, having worked with them for a period of time, that if they changed, you can actually ask them the question, and it's good practice to do that, without sort of interfering with their lives. Just saying, look, I just wanted to check in with you. Is everything okay with you? And then they got the option. They could say, oh, no, everything's okay, mate, thanks for asking. Or they might answer and say, look, I've got a few problems. Or they might come back to you later on in the day or a couple of days later and say, you asked me the other day if everything's okay, and, at the time I didn't really want to answer it, but as it happens, this and this is happening. Can we chat about it over a coffee somewhere? There is a culture in the workplace that we are often afraid to approach for the reasons you said. And we are on the whole male-dominated industry. Although in consultancy there's a bit more balance. But whether there is a balance between the sexes or not, we can exercise the gift, if you like, the gift of kindness. I
think you're right, and I think it's something we need to work on globally throughout the industry. I think, as you say, consultancy, there's a bit more of a balance. I think that's we're learning, but I interface with people on a regular basis that are on site, that are tradespeople, site managers, etc. And arguably, not speaking about anyone in particular, but there is still a culture of the big, hard, sort of gruff workforce that, people don't particularly want to speak. And I think part of the reason I was encouraged to meet you today, to work with Sarah on this topic is hopefully some of those people will be watching this. And it's an important message for us to say, look, actually, the difference between going out on a limb and just speaking to somebody for 5 minutes and not could be life-changing. I'm not going to get into statistics, but the construction industry is renowned for suicide rates and things, which is obviously a horrible thing to say, but we've got to face the facts. Understanding a little bit more about this, and again, Sarah will push into this in terms of what we can do, but understanding this, being prepared to step out of your comfort zone if you're concerned about somebody is the fundamental message that I want to deliver. What, perhaps we'll touch on a few more of these subjects as we go through, but behavioural symptoms are probably the more recognisable ones. So people procrastinating, people not eating or drinking the way they used to be. You've already touched on the fact that people might look shattered, or just not be as responsive as usual. Are there any outside of that you would say is common overlooked as a symptom?
We very much overlook the role of the senior person in industry, and we mustn't be judgmental or stereotypical. But I have a feeling that when we talk about burnout, that is something that's experienced a lot more through the senior management teams, where they put a lot of energy into their process. Yes, they might be stressed. Yes, they might be anxious, and a blue collar worker can be burned out as much as a white collar worker. But if you, at the moment, because there is a focus on the 2.4 million workers, sometimes we overlook the managers, the leaders in the industry that are not immune from having poor mental health.
Yeah.
So I think this whole concept of burnout really reminds me that mental health is something that's suffered by everybody, or everyone has. Good mental health, bad mental health, and it's important. In the focus for the majority, we don't forget the minority, which is still a large number of people
I agree.
that represent our leadership, and they can be more identified as suffering from burnout, I think that raises quite an important point that we mustn't overlook.
Practically, maybe harder to spot as well sometimes. I know a lot of senior roles. Management roles, they tend to be isolated roles as well, in terms of like physical location, office-based, not interacting with as many people as perhaps they would like. And obviously now, in the modern world with teams, I think that's a huge thing, that there's a distance now between people that never used to exist. And I appreciate it's been a while that we've been doing this, but we used to have more regular board meetings. We used to be in rooms with our peers far more often. Now we still virtually sit in those rooms, but you don't get quite the same level of connection, and maybe it's harder to spot. So I think that's something to consider as well. And
when you're dealing with someone who's working from home, you don't know they haven't been asleep just before the team's meeting and then go straight back to sleep, or just lying on the couch just staring into space.
Yeah.
So it does create a lot of difficult challenges. So I think the trick is to evolve proper controls and systems, and there are standards that we should be aware of that we should adopt. So we got BS 45003, which deals with psychological risk in regards to mental health and safety in the workplace, and this is another tool in the box. That is available for the industry to research and become aware of, and implement it in its company, processes and policies. Because we have had a change in working patterns and working life, except for the people that work, building walls and knocking up roofs and things like that. But for the people that support the industry, the consultants, the architects, the engineers, quantity surveyors, the highway people, the myriad of consultants we got, they are working differently.
Yeah.
And, we have to change as an industry, as a society, with the times, recognise the changes and plan for them. We do, when it comes to physical health and safety, we look at every site on a bespoke basis. We identify the risks, we do our risk assessments and method statements. But when it comes to mental health, we just do not.
That's an interesting point, actually, and I perhaps never even thought about it that way myself. Most of the people that listen to the Build Insights podcast are construction-minded people or people looking to get into the industry. Most of them will understand a risk assessment and a method statement, which is fundamentally the mechanism for keeping people safe, regardless of the action. Applying that to this is something that perhaps needs to be looked at more prevalently and more proactively, because I would argue, and I don't know the statistics, and maybe you can give me some insight to this in terms of what it looks like, but all of the factors that we've just discussed, remote working, distance, isolation, so on and so forth, must have had a fairly large impact on the mental health ratings in a negative way, I would argue.
I think it always has, but it's only now been sort of recognised. But there is nothing to stop the formulation of a specific mental health action plan to sit alongside the physical health action plan.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important part. We've got a lot of health and safety managers in the industry, but we can have mental health managers as well.
Valid point.
I already hear down the wires people going, the cost. We can't afford that. But if you look at research, and I refer specifically to Deloitte's report at Tipping Point, they don't talk about the cost of dealing with mental health. They talk about the investment, and that for every £1 invested in mental health, there's a £4.70 return.
Is that right?
And that's massive, and there's nothing stopping us doing that.
I think it's fundamentally important. I think, the very fact that that we're talking about this now in the context that we are, the fact that we're trying to reach the people that listen to this podcast is a small stepping stone in the campaign to make people aware of the fundamental requirement to take action. Yeah. And that's a great example of a mechanism that could be employed by people. Yeah. It's a fantastic analogy that people can relate to in terms of what to do. Is there anywhere in particular people can look for further guidance on that?
There is a lot of research if you want to research the research, but there's a lot of easy to understand reports. So there's the Understanding Mental Health, which was produced by the Chartered Institute of Building.
Okay.
They have a really good report. It's full of statistics, great graphics, and a lot of links to other reports. So there is that sort of stuff that's out there.
That sounds interesting. I'll be interested to read that myself.
Yeah.
You were just talking about risk assessments and method statements,
yeah.
But also I'd like to circle back to the cost. You were saying for every £1 invested in mental health, the employer can sort of see a return of £4.70.
Yeah.
Was that correct? Can you sort of break that down a little bit for me?
So basically, how that's achieved is reduction in presenteeism, where people come into work and they're not working, a reduction in absenteeism, when they're not at work at all. They're less likely to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. They're likely to be more happy at work, so their productivity is going to be higher anyway. The quality of works is going to be better. And, in the home environment, it's a happy wife, happy life. In a work...
We'll have no sexism here.
I'm already regretting saying that. But you know the point. So, but in the workplace, a happy worker is not a shirker. I just made that up.
There we go. Let's make that a thing.
Yeah. Someone who's going to really give their all because they're in the right headspace for it. They're more incentivised. And, we talk about money cost, but there's a lot of things we can do that don't involve any money.
Of course.
So saying thank you. I remember I did a toolbox talk a couple of years ago now, and I started off by thanking the workforce for their efforts, And everyone was looking agog. And I think that some of them have been working in the industry for decades and they've never been thanked, ever, for their efforts. I talk about kindness. And that's not by accident, because that was a theme of World Mental Health Day a few years ago. And you think, oh, that's an intangible concept. Why the hell? But, kindness is one of the things that stimulates the right chemicals in the brain. It's very easy to do, make someone a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Open the door for them.
Yeah.
Say happy birthday when it's their birthday.
Yeah.
Really just simple things that, do not cost anything at all. And just because we work in a predominantly macho environment, that doesn't mean to say that we can't be kind to someone and have common manners.
No, of course. That doesn't mean to say that, appreciation and recognition, as you're saying, is something which, doesn't need to be, sort of appreciated. I'd like to sort of delve into what as an employer, I mean, obviously you sort of mentioned, for free, appreciation and recognition. Yeah. What else could an employer do to help their workforce, to limit the burnout, to limit the stress, to sort of help or provide the mechanisms for their workforce?
So BS 45003 provides some really good detailed steps.
Could you clarify a bit on what that is?
You're looking at what in the workplace might cause a difficulty. So I remember talking about window design in an office environment. So if you've got windows that are drafty, or they are positioned, well, they're positioned where they're positioned, but if desks are positioned in the wrong place relative to the window, so you get glare. There's nothing worse, is there, when you're working on your computer and the sun's in their eye and you can't see the screen properly, or it's making your eyes water, all the rest of it. Just changing the office layout. Make sure the lighting is appropriate. Putting a desk lamp, on someone's desk. Looking at physical factors within
acoustics, I suppose, as well.
Acoustics, toileting arrangements. The canteens, what can be done in the office environment, to make it less stressful. I don't want to be crude about anything, and I'll not be, but I'm sure many people remember going into toilets where there's no toilet paper, and how stressful that can be. And it sounds funny, isn't it? And we were laughing. I've told some funny stories about that, but it's a horrible thing, isn't it? Just to make sure someone is tasked with the job of making sure that there's soap in the toilets, the hygiene bins are empty,
the hand dryers work,
just
all that sort of stuff.
There's water in the water coolers. The kettle looks clean, the fridge is cleaned out. Really easy stuff. And then beyond that, training up to mental health first aiders, in the workplace. We wouldn't dream of opening an office or having any work environment without a physical health and safety first aider. Why do we even have to have a discussion about having a mental health first aider, in the workforce? It should just be a given. That's what we have. And then we're looking at developing policies so that people know, where to get help through, either from their retained EAP, or, in a worst case scenario, they know how to access the Samaritans, or that there's a policy which guides them to other mental health support charities, like Makes in Mind, the Lighthouse Instruction Charity, or,
Andy's Man Club, Makes in Mind,
or even the NHS, and just having those sort of little posters available or something on your intranet, so people can feel comfortable in accessing them, so they don't even have to ask someone in the office if they're feeling, a bit embarrassed or whatever, but they know they need help. But if there's something there that's easily accessible, that can make a big difference.
So in your opinion, what do you think the role of the mental health first aider plays in the sort of in helping an employee who's going through a rough time, or not feeling their usual self, what do you think?
So the manager would play exactly the same role as a physical health and safety manager advisor.
Yep.
They come in and do the risk assessment, and look at the things we just talked about, and other bespoke factors. Going back to the site environment, dust, weather, the welfare facilities. It strikes me that we are a very clever group of people in construction. And we've constructed some amazing buildings, some really difficult technological, civil engineering projects. But we can't master the site welfare unit.
The human side.
And it's just so simple. And I was just thinking about the welfare unit, okay? And I telephoned a well-known manufacturer of welfare units. And I said, can we improve the welfare unit to make it warmer in the winter or colder in the summer? And the person at the other end of the phone sort of proudly announced to me that they now got treble glazed windows and they've increased the amount of insulation in the walls. And I said, well, if you've got 12 people going into living in a welfare unit and they all enter at different times, they all want to go out for a wee or a vape or a smoke, and then they leave at different times. So in a 45-minute break, that door is open 48 times. And having extra insulation in the wall or treble glazing is not going to make a jot of difference. Yeah. And I thought about, well, what can we do? So my initial thought turned to putting a porch on with the doors at 90 degrees to each other.
Okay, yeah, sort of like an airlock.
So like an airlock, and it also could be a place to store muddy boots. And I thought, maybe that'll take up space, and we all know that space is a premium. And so I spoke to this about a contractor, and they said, Mark, you're a clever guy, why don't we have an internal porch? And I thought, well, that seems like a good idea. And I thought, well, maybe we can do that. But then I thought about the experience of going to Tesco's and Sainsbury's. So we go shopping, and no matter what the temperature is outside, inside the shop, it's fine. And they have a heat curtain above the door.
Yeah.
That blows down cold air or hot air. Well, why can't we put a heat curtain, an air conditioning unit above the door in a welfare unit to keep the temperature constant inside? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm no technical guru. And if I can think of that, so can others.
Doesn't sound too difficult, does it?
Doesn't sound too difficult. And, and there are a whole plethora of very, very simple things that we can do that actually have no or nominal cost that can make a huge difference to people's welfare. And, we just apply ourselves. If we can put together, high-rise buildings, put tunnels, under the Thames and other places, and build railways across London, under London and other metropolitan areas, then we can work out how to keep a welfare unit at a constant temperature. And there's no excuse in this day and age, or any day and age, for us not to, sit down. Now, to bring it back to the question you asked, what role can a mental health manager play in that? Yeah. They can identify those sort of things and help, bring the people in the business or external people together to deal with these things.
Whose responsibility would it be, the mental health first aider, for example, to sort of identify the culture within the company, or do you feel that that's more sort of senior management level to be able to identify and address those issues and then have it trickle down?
The culture of the company is set by the directors.
Everyone does it. Yep. You've got very comfy. You're leaning a little bit that way, trying to sit up. Yeah. It's a common thing. You're right.
The culture of a company is set by the directors,
and
not by the mental health first aider. What the mental health first aider is there to do is to be available for anyone that is having difficulty to approach them, and they use the ALG method of signposting them and encouraging them to get help. Being a little bit more proactive, a mental health first aider can actually approach someone if they feel that there is a need to do so in the right way, because they've had a little bit of training. But it's certainly not up to mental health first aider to set the culture, can contribute to it. Important contributions can be made, as it can be made by anyone, whether they're a mental health first aider or not. But it is responsibility of the directors to set the tone, to make sure the policies are written, and to look after their staff, and if need be, to make reasonable adjustments for people that need a reasonable adjustments to be made. And that's part of the legislative framework. And very often people talk about making reasonable adjustments and thinking about having wider doors for disabled people or stuff like that. But again, our natural thinking at present does not extend to dealing with mental health issues. And, there's still this stigma, around mental health. And, the feeling that, that somehow you're a crackpot, you get, stuck into a little pigeonhole of being not a trustworthy person. But every single person has a mental health issue at some time in their life.
Yeah.
25% of the people have mental health issues at one time or another. And, and that can be caused by all sorts of things that are going on in home life, work life, your physical health that is impacting on your mental health. And because it's so prevalent, again, I question why it's not so inbred into our company culture, our way of life, to actually recognise that and have the systems in place to deal with it.
So, in your opinion, what do you think the sort of the ideal world looks like, where it's legislation that every employer needs to have, like in an office that you have to have health and safety risk assessment, for example. In construction, we have to do various different risk assessments. We have first aiders within the office. When do you think it become legislation that you have to have a mental health first aider in the office?
So I was campaigning quite vocally with JCT,
right,
to include provision.
Sorry.
So the JCT, the Joint Contracts Tribunal, who produce the contracts which govern 70% of the construction work in the UK.
Right.
And I was asking them to include some clauses within the 2024 edition, which would have the impact of putting obligations for mental health on a par with the obligations made for physical health.
Yep.
And that didn't happen in 2024, but I remain hopeful that will happen sooner rather than later. And the reason I was asking for that, and really in direct answer to your question, we are a rules-based society.
Yep.
And even though we know things aren't good for us, unless there's some sort of obligation, we tend not to do it. And I've highlighted things within construction and outside construction. The earliest I can remember is the wearing of seatbelts. So everybody knew that if you didn't wear your seatbelt and your car stopped suddenly, your journey was likely to continue for a couple of yards, unfortunately, through the intervening windscreen. But no one wore their seatbelt. I didn't wear my seatbelt. It was just no one wore it. But as soon as there was a law, you had to wear your seatbelt, because if you passed a police car, you were going to get a fine.
Yep.
Wearing of crash helmets, smoking indoors,
Yep.
and a whole load of related stuff. In construction industry, we got the horrible circumstance of Grenfell. And, people knew at the time that putting something combustible in a cavity was not a great idea. But it's still taken the Building Safety Act to compel people to
not to do that.
And to look at competency. The fact that we didn't properly look at competency. And then, other areas, like, and it's in construction, outside construction, but the warning sounds on lorries when they turn left, we've known for decades.
Or when vans are reversing something along those lines.
We need to do something. But until there was a law or regulation, that didn't happen. Now, I don't think there's going to be legislation anytime soon.
Right.
So therefore, the industry has an obligation to really create the obligation for the industry to do something for mental health, in my view.
So obviously, until there is legislation, but say there is an employer out there who really does care, cares about their employees, cares about their mental and physical health. What do you think the top 3 things are that any employer could do to keep their staff mentally safe?
I'm going to just divert slightly from that, because when you talk about your staff, that is a very interesting thing, because the top rung of the construction tree, the tier 1s, employ very few people. So according to the Office of National Statistics, 85% of companies registered, that's around 64,000, employ less than 24 people.
Okay, so I'll change that. I'll change the wording to all workers and subcontractors, people who are working on your site or in your office.
So the top one is to have a whole supply chain obligation.
Yep.
In the same way as we're responsible if anyone fell down a manhole because the manhole lid wasn't on, or went down a vertical shaft because there's no protection, there's a clear responsibility, there's a clear obligation on behalf or on the part of the employers, site managers, to do something about it. So there needs to be that obligation for the whole supply chain.
Yep.
Now, we know causation, or some of the top 10 causes are money pressures, lack of payment, working to unrealistic programs, having no control over your workforce, and that's a big cause of stress. But we live in a modern society, and we can have a suggestion box, costs nothing. So people can feel that they have some sort of control. They can be consulted and asked, instead of being told. It just changes it. It's like a massive thing. It's just so easy to do. We talk about better payment systems. There's no obligation for the big companies to report their sort of payment processes.
Yeah.
But we still have very long payment process, which by the time you get down to the tier 3, tier 4s, mean that people aren't getting paid for 90 days or 120 days.
Yeah.
Now, we've got the Construction Act, which is supposed to promote, better payments, quicker dispute resolution. But it still gives a latitude for people to agree their own, payment terms. And I think that we need to do something about that. It's quite clear. 28 days payment from the top, 45-day payments for the tier 2s and below, and no one having a payment extended beyond 50 days as a long stop. And
it's ambitious.
well, you think, well, yeah, you say that, but why should it be ambitious? Because I don't believe companies' fortunes, the people at the top, the tier 1s, their profit line is that impacted by delaying payments a week. The interest rates are not that high, on savings. And, and it starts with employers, doesn't it?
That's it. I mean, that's obviously fundamentally what we're here talking about is the employer's responsibility.
So JCT and other contracts talk about 14-day payments. You don't have to write a check anymore. You press a button.
Yeah.
It's very easy to make a payment. There is no excuse for longing this out and impacting all the way down the supply chain. And I say there's no excuse for not embracing the supply chain in the decision-making process, to listening to what they have to say, to dealing with their welfare in a proper way. And I think those things can directly impact on the causes of stress, and taking it back to burnout. It makes life a lot easier for those people that might be burned out because they're not beating their head against the wall.
I suppose very simply it's like consultation, payments, and facilities.
Yes. Yeah,
very
good summary. Yeah,
very simple things.
Very simple things.
They are very quick fixes, and if there are any employers out there who do want to sort of make steps into making their sort of employees and people who work in their supply chains life better, then that's great advice.
Yeah.
So, Mark, we've spoken very briefly about what an employee can do. What can an employee do if they are not feeling themselves, if they've identified something in themselves or in a co-worker? What do you think somebody should do to look out for each other?
Well, I think the co-worker, in a way it's a lot easier because you can approach your co-worker and say, look, is everything all right with you? Bob, Jane, Mary, whatever. And just ask the question, whether you get an answer or not is irrelevant because you're showing you care, you're showing an interest, and, they have an opportunity to respond or think about it. Doing so for yourself, strangely, is a little bit more difficult because people are afraid that they might lose their jobs or, they'll be off work and they may not be able to do the hours they need in a week. And I get that. But if people are aware through signposting in welfare offices and their managers are clued up and making sure when they have the toolbox talks and the regular briefings that, they can be approached for mental health. It will encourage people that feel they need to talk about something or need to have something addressed to do so. But there really needs to be the culture within the companies to help facilitate that. And if they feel they can't do it in the workplace, these awareness posters and things like that, they can do it when they get home.
Yeah.
They can contact their GPs, they can go on to helplines, and, they shouldn't be afraid to do that. These people that are available on the helplines and GPs, are very well versed in dealing with people with mental health issues.
Of course.
And it's a bit like, same for a man or woman that finds a lump. It's sometimes very difficult to say, I found a lump, I need to get it checked out. But the advice universally is get it checked out.
Yeah.
And the same applies to mental health. If you're not feeling right, you've got suicide ideation, you're feeling depressed, you've started getting into alcohol, drugs, gambling, other addictions, then, it's having that honest conversation with yourself and not being afraid to address those issues. Now, I do accept that it's very easy for me to say that and less easy for someone to do it. But, I would always encourage anyone, anyone listening to this podcast or anywhere else, to take that brave step and, seek the help that they need, because that is the first step, difficult step on the road to recovery and improvement.
I think it's really sort of quite relevant to point out that sort of adverse mental health doesn't discriminate at all.
No.
Doesn't matter who you are, how much money you earn, or fame, fortune. It can affect anybody. You could be the CEO or you could be a ground worker.
Just to emphasise that.
Yeah.
We're all aware through press that both Prince William and Prince Harry have sought counselling help for things that have happened in their life. So that really supports what you're saying. There is no barriers. It can impact on everyone with your, whatever role you have in life. You are as likely to have a mental health issue at some point in your life as anybody else on this planet.
Wow. Wow, that was a lot of information to absorb in just a short space of time.
It really was.
I don't know how you feel, but I'm just kind of like...
For me, it was interesting because I don't think I recognise some of the symptoms that constitute burnout and stress. And I'd be the first to say that looking at the list in front of me now, I've certainly experienced a lot of these in isolation and sometimes together. And it's important perhaps to be able to recognise that and understand when it's becoming an issue. I think inherently our roles in the industry as senior members within our respective organisations, these symptoms are inherent of an industry that places a lot of demand on us. And it's given me something to take away actually and think about in terms of how I perhaps manage and recognise myself.
I think that's so important, Ben, and I actually, got a little bit of goosebumps. The fact that you've actually sort of recognised these symptoms in yourself, I think that that is a message which everybody needs to be able to understand, and being able to recognise these symptoms of stress, anxiety, burnout, depression. It's so important, and not to brush them under the carpet, but to find it within yourself, to actually face these issues, contact your GP, contact your employer, contact your workplace mental health first aider, and get the ball rolling to alleviate these symptoms.
Yeah, it's important to know when in isolation some of these things are more common than others, but actually when does a problem start to occur? When do you lose control of this? And for me, what we've learned from Marc today, what we've discussed between ourselves, is hopefully allowing people to get some insight into that and to understand from their perspective, because what might be a bad day for me might be a bigger problem for someone else. What might be a bigger problem for someone else might be the opposite way around.
I think it's also, it's interesting when you just said it is its own individual perspective. It is your own individual limits, and it's understanding your own individual limits, because it's like a pain threshold. Some people can deal with, child labour without any kind of medication at all, which is, wonderful, if you can do that. But I was screaming for an epidural very quickly on in the process. So, everybody has different limits. Everybody can shoulder and continue at different rates and different speeds. I think the call to action here is being able to identify those things in yourself, which what you've just spoken about. I think as an employer as well, the really simple things which Marc talked about, changing in the environment slightly, just to move around of the office, windows, glare, acoustics, those sorts of things. It's just so simple.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in certainly from on the podcast that I do more regularly, we talk about the built environment and how that impacts us. We talk about the walk down the street, the stairs down to the tube in London, all these things. But it's a great analogy, or rather a parallel, to pull together and say that those considerations go as far as to how someone feels on a daily basis. They contribute greatly to and impact greatly on someone's daily life. So what a wonderful way to tie in this incredibly important subject to what we both do in the built environment.
Exactly.
I think I've got a couple of takeaways from this. One is identify, understand what things look like. The other is consider the environment, consider the situation, and probably the biggest of all, and this goes to everybody, no matter whether they feel these symptoms, whether they think they recognise someone to have these symptoms, if they're an organiser, if they're whatever you are, it's got to be communicate. I think if people can break down the barriers, the stigmas attached to mental health, especially in the bravado world of construction, and talk about these things, I would argue, as a non-professional, non-qualified mental health practitioner, that we could stop so many things escalating into a terrible situation. So that's my takeaway.
Mine is, Safe and Sound, the podcast, was started to have the difficult conversations, or to start having the conversations that nobody really wants to talk about. And if we can normalise talking about mental health, adverse mental health, understanding it doesn't discriminate, doesn't care who you are, doesn't care if you're CEO or a ground worker or royalty, as Marc mentioned, it can affect anybody. And until, as an industry or as human beings, we normalise this conversation.
Then until that happens, and it's always going to be something that we have to push through forums like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope this podcast becomes redundant very quickly. I hope people don't need to watch this. I hope that Marc doesn't have to spread his expertise via these platforms, because people are dealing with this. But in the interim, I've been delighted that we could bring our two worlds together for this recording, and that with Marc's expertise, we've been able to portray a narrative that hopefully people can latch onto. And I don't often do this, but I will. If there's anyone watching this that just needs to speak, you can get in touch with, as you've already said, your GP. You can get in touch with your first aider, your mental health first aider. You can get in touch with the podcast. We will speak to people for you. Now, I will caveat, we don't watch that mailbox 24/7. If you've got a very serious situation, ring a specialist. But if you just want to learn a little bit more, then by all means, drop us a message. We'll put you in touch with the right people.
It's been great collaborating with you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolute pleasure.
Here's to many more.
Hopefully.
Cheers.